In analyzing itself, it judges its own case. It needs a vantage point outside itself, and is confronted with a choice between accepting itself from the test or rule imposed on all other knowledge, thus leaving itself open to attack from behind, or else subjecting itself to the laws and the process which it has discovered and thereby committing an act of circular reasoning, as is clearly illustrated by the self-negation of skepticism. Only a relativistic epistemology does not claim exemption from its own principle. It is not destroyed by the fact that its validity is only relative. For even if it is valid, historically, factually, psychologically, only in alternation and harmony with other absolute or substantial principles, its relation to its own opposite is itself only relative. Heuristics, which is only the consequence or the application of the relativistic principle to the categories of knowledge, can accept without contradiction that it is itself a heuristic principle. The question as to the grounding of this principle, which is not incorporated in the principle itself, constitutes no difficulty for relativism, because the ground is removed to infinity. Relativism strives to dissolve into a relation every absolute that presents itself, and proceeds in the same way with the absolute that offers itself as the ground for this new relation. This is a never-ending process, whose heuristic eliminates the alternative, either to deny or to accept the absolute. It makes no difference how one expresses it, either that there is an absolute but it can be grasped only by an infinite process, or that there are only relations, but that they can only replace the absolute in an infinite process. Relativism is able to make the radical concession that it is possible for the mind to place itself outside itself. The epistemological principles that remained content with one concept and thus excluded the continuing fruitful development of relations ended in self-contradiction, that the mind is supposed to judge itself, that it is either subject to its own definitive statements or exempt from them, and that equally each alternative destroys its validity. But relativism fully accepts the fact that for every proposition there is a higher one that determines whether this proposition is correct. But this second proposition, the logical authority that we ourselves establish, requires, considered as a psychological process, further legitimation by a higher proposition for which the same process repeats itself ad infinitum, either by an alternation of the validation between two judgments, or by treating the same content on one occasion as psychological reality, and on another as a logical principle. This view also removes the hazard that other epistemological principles faced, of ending in self-negation by subjecting themselves to their own statements. It is not correct to argue that skepticism, by denying the possibility of truth, must itself be untrue, any more than the pessimistic view of the wickedness of all that exists makes pessimism itself a wicked theory. For it is, in fact, the fundamental ability of our mind to judge itself and to establish its own law over itself. This is nothing but the expression or expansion of the basic fact of self-awareness. Our mind has no substantial unity, but only the unity that results from the interaction between the subject and object into which the mind divides itself. This is not an accidental form of the mind, which could be different without changing our essential qualities. It is rather the decisive form of the mind. To have a mind means nothing more than to execute this inner separation, to make the self an object, to be able to know oneself. That there is no subject without an object, no object without a subject is realized first within the mind, which raises itself as the knowing subject above itself, as the object known, and by knowing this knowledge of itself, the life of the mind proceeds necessarily in the progressus ad infinitum. Its actual form, its cross-section, as it were, is a circular movement. The subject knows itself as an object and knows the object as a subject. Relativism as an epistemological principle proves itself by its subordination to its own principle, a process that proves fatal to many absolute principles. Thus relativism expresses most clearly what it is also able to perform for those other principles, the legitimation of the mind's capacity to judge itself, without making the process illusory no matter what the result of this judgment may be. For this setting oneself outside oneself appears now as the basis of the mind is subject and object at the same time. Only if this infinite process of knowing itself and judging itself is cut at any one link, which then confronts all the others as an absolute, does it become self-contradictory, in the sense that knowledge judging itself claims exemption for itself from the content of this judgment in order to pass judgment on it. The relativistic view has often been considered as a degradation of the value, reliability, and significance of things, regardless of the fact that only the naive adherence to something absolute, which is here questioned, could put relativism in such a position. In reality, however, it is the contrary that is true. Only through the continuous dissolution of any rigid separateness into interaction do we approach the functional unity of all elements of the universe, in which the significance of each element affects everything else. Consequently, relativism is closer than one is inclined to think to its extreme opposite, Spinoza's philosophy, with its all-embracing substantia sed deus. This absolute, which has no other content than the universal concept of being, includes in its unity everything that exists. Individual things no longer have any existence by themselves, since all being is in reality unified in the divine substance, just as the abstract concept of being forms a unity. All particular continuities and substantialities, all second-order absolutes, are so completely merged in that single absolute that one might say, all the contents of the worldview have become relativities in a monism such as Spinoza's. The all-embracing substance, the only absolute that remains, can now be disregarded without thereby affecting the content of reality. The expropriator will be expropriated, as Marx says of a process that is similar in form, and nothing remains but the relativistic dissolution of things into relations and processes. The interdependence of things, which relativism establishes as their essence, excludes the notion of infinity only on a superficial view, or if relativism is not conceived in a sufficiently radical way. The contrary is indeed true. A concrete infinity seems to me conceivable only in two ways. First, as a rising or falling series, where every link depends upon another, and a third one is dependent upon it, as may be the case with spatial distribution, causal transmission of energy, chronological sequences, or logical derivation.